Welcome back to English 101, Rhetoric 1. This is our unity, or rather, our rhetoric and writing lecture for week 8. And we're going to talk about unity and coherence, peer response, and a little bit about punctuation as well. I think I wrote peer response twice, so I really wanted to emphasize that, I guess, and a little bit of a typo there on my PowerPoint. But let's get into what we're going to talk about here with unity and coherence. Unity is just another word for focus, I think, when we talk about writing. But we usually, in academic writing, we talk about unity, meaning everything's focused on one idea or a group of ideas, and you don't stray from that, but you stay focused. So that's what we're really talking about with unity. If you look at the word unity, it kind of has to do with like meaning being about one thing, right? Or connected, everything connected. Coherence means it's understandable. If you can understand me, hopefully my headphones, my little microphone here is good enough that you can hear me if you're watching this video. And so if you can understand what I'm saying, I'm coherent. I'm not incoherent. If I started speaking another language that you weren't familiar with or something, maybe I would be incoherent. Or if I was just very tired, I might be incoherent, which I am a little bit here on Friday night. But so that's what we're going to talk about in some ways that you can achieve that in your writing. So being understood more clearly and then being focused is what we're really talking about. And the book calls it Unity and Coherence, pages 20 to 24 in the Heartbrace Essentials book. All right, so let's look at just an example. One way to make your writing a little more understandable, easy to understand, and focused too, is using patterns of organization. And we talked a little bit about these, but I just want to go back and just go over a couple of examples quickly. One of the most important ones is to use what's called chronological order as a way of organizing either a process or a narrative or a story kind of. So this is a process paragraph, but you can also use chronological order a lot with a narrative telling a story. But when you're trying to give instructions or tell somebody how to do something, it makes sense to use process writing. So here's a process of getting a television show into production. And then you'll notice these bold words are what are called transitional words. And so if you're writing about a process, if you're writing about telling a story that happened in time chronological order, you could use words like first and then and next and finally. And each one of these is a step in this process. So again, chronological order is really useful for process writing and also narrative writing, telling a story. And I'm not going to read through this, but if you want to pause and take a look at this, you can see this is a good example of a process paragraph, and that's one of the patterns of organization you could use to make your writing more understandable or more coherent, we could say. Another way of arranging a paragraph to make it more coherent is to use what's called spatial order. This is normally used for a description, especially a physical description. And if you look at this paragraph, you have a topic sentence that's underlined here. The person's talking about how, when the city life, wherever they live, they're not in Jamaica, it doesn't sound like, gets too much for them, they return in their mind to their hometown in St. Mary, Jamaica. And as you look at this, these transitions are all, they're not saying first, second, third, like in a time order passage, but the transitions are talking about space, place, physical space, right? High up in a mango tree, sitting up there in this tree, looking down through the lush vegetation, down to the coconut growth, beyond is a wide valley, farther out. So you can imagine, if you read this, it's something like a movie camera might move really slowly from this person up in a tree all the way down to out at the in the ocean and then back up to the tree again, and they're sitting there eating a mango. So that's using spatial order to give your writing more coherence, to make it more understandable. And again, we usually do that most effectively with a description, and in particular a physical description. If we were describing someone's personality, we might use something more like what's called emphatic order or something like that. But let's look at another example. This is speaking of emphatic order. This is an example of a paragraph about an African-American filmmaker, one of the earliest African-American filmmakers that we know about, who received some accolades for his work. Oscar Micheaux was the most successful and influential African-American filmmaker in the first half of the 20th century. So here's our topic sentence, and then we're going to learn some important things about Micheaux, where he's from, and what he did, and we're going to use these kinds of transitions like the word more notably, and then above all, which is going to probably be his most important thing, is that he offered audiences positive and complex images of African Americans not otherwise seen in Hollywood films. He died in 1951. So these 2 points are kind of you're emphasizing these things, and that's why we call it emphatic order. Sometimes we call it order of importance, and you might say, the same thing. You could use transitions like most important, also important, things like that. So again, we're another way of organizing to help our writing to be more coherent is to use what's called emphatic order. And then finally, the last one is we call it logical order, and that's basically just going from a general to specific, or vice versa, from specific to general. And what we mean by that is, let's look at this example just to show. Whether one reads for work or pleasure, comprehension is the goal. So whatever you're doing with reading, your goal obviously is to understand, maybe enjoy, but mainly to understand what you're reading, right? You've got to understand first before you can enjoy. And so this gives you a series of different groups of people going from general to specific. So if you look at it, readers, the first one, readers, it just says readers. That means anybody who can read, which is a huge group of people, right? Must interact and be engaged. To accomplish this, proficient readers. So now we're talking about those readers who are not only readers that can read, but they're very good readers. They're proficient. And then, so that's a little bit smaller group of people. If you just took the total population, different countries have different literacy rates. I'm curious to see what the literacy rate is in the U.S., but it's fairly high. So, and then you have a smaller group of people who are really strong readers. And then you have an even smaller group probably who are maybe not so proficient or not good at reading. And then finally you have adult literacy learners, which is a very small group, people who cannot read and write, and they're learning that potentially when they're older, later in life. So this goes, if you think of like a funnel, right? It's big at the top and it gets smaller, or vice versa. You could have a triangle, like a pyramid, right? Small at the top and it gets larger. But that bigger part is your general idea, the big picture. And as you move through this paragraph, it starts to shrink until we get down to this very small group of people who are adult literacy learners. So again, these are categories, ways of organizing this logical order that can help you organize a paragraph or potentially a whole essay or paper. Now again, with these, I'm going to just share a couple of examples, and if you wanted to pause this and think about it for a minute, you could to kind of quiz yourself. But I'm just thinking, you're in a class, let's say, at Morton College, and you're taking a class on early childhood education, and your teacher asks you to observe a preschool classroom and write a paragraph describing one of the students. So what form of organization might you use to, what pattern? Chronological, that's time order. Spatial, remember physical. Emphatic, most important, least important, and so on. And logical, going from general to specific. So if you want to pause this for a minute, you could. But I'll tell you, I'll go ahead and tell you what I think would probably be best. Now, it all depends. When I talk to students about this in class, I get different answers, of course. Some people do say chronological, and that would be if you were just going to tell the story of, I walked into class and there was Jimmy, and he did this and he did that and he did this and he did that. You could tell it that way. Other people say spatial might be interesting because you're describing. And I think this is probably the best one for this if you're actually describing. Notice the assignment says, or the prompt here, to describe. And to physically describe one of the children, you'd probably want to say he has a yellow shirt, et cetera, et cetera. And you'd go from top to bottom, from head to toe, and describe that child. You might also describe his environment around him, what his desk looks like, and or so on. So again, I think spatial would be the best, but some people use chronological depending on what you want to do. You could also do emphasis, but spatial would be good for a physical description. Next one, let's imagine you're in a computer science classroom now, and your professor has asked you to explain the different security needs of, first, a general consumer, a small business owner, and then finally a large corporation. So if you want to take a minute and think about that, which one of these that we just talked about, chronological, spatial, emphatic, and logical, might be more useful? And I'll just tell you, like, again, if you want to pause and think about it, you can, but I'll go ahead and go on. So if we look at this, let's say she's the general consumer over here, the average person, just like me. I don't have any really specific security needs more than anybody else, right? Just like her. That means if you think about that funnel again, that's the big general idea. Lots and lots and lots of people would fit into that category. Now, if we move across here, the small business owner, now we have some different security needs, because you might have maybe you have billing information, credit card information stored, or addresses, different things related to your clients or customers. And so you're going to have a little bit higher security needs or different security needs than I would. So that's a smaller group of people. So you see we're going with this funnel, right? And then finally, you have Apple Corporation or Google or Amazon or Target or Bank of America. Those corporations are going to have some really specific, it's a small number of corporations compared to the 330 or 40 million people that live in the United States. They're maybe the general user, right? So the funnel, the group gets smaller, smaller, smaller. So which one of these would you use? And it would be, I think it would be logical order, where you move from a general idea to a specific or vice versa. All right, I think this is our, no, we got two more. Okay, so this one, you're in maybe a nursing class or something related to healthcare, and you have to write a paragraph that explains how to take a patient's blood pressure. So think about that for a minute. Which order, which kind of arrangement might you use for your paragraph? And I'll say I would think this would be chronological, because if you're giving somebody instructions on how to do something, usually the best thing to do is to arrange it in time order. You do this first, you wrap the little thing around the arm, you squeeze the, whatever you do with blood pressure, right? So that would be chronological, I think would be our best choice there. Okay, this is the last one. Now you're in a history class and your history professor asks you to write a paragraph that explains the most important actions that Cesar Chavez took to bring attention to the plight of farm workers. So a very famous civil rights and labor activist in the 60s and 70s. So you're going to talk about his most important actions. So does that sound like any of these might just fit? Think about that for a second if you want to pause. And yeah, emphatic order is what I would use here, because emphasis, you want to emphasize what he did. He did this. This was something he did that was great. He also did this. And most importantly, he did this, right? So you're going to share these things that that Cesar Chavez did to help bring attention to the plight of farm workers in the U.S. All right, these are some things I'm going to skip through a little bit, but obviously using pronouns is a great way to make your writing more coherent and understandable. And I'm not going to really go through this. We're going to talk about pronouns too a little bit later, I think, in the semester. But sometimes instead of repeating, obviously, the keywords, you can use pronouns like both or there to keep references clear within one paragraph. And also sometimes repetition. Again, I'm not going to read through this, but repeating key phrases and words can sometimes be useful. Now, if you're only repeating a word because you can't think of another word, that's an occasion where you probably want to Google thesaurus or look up the word synonym for something and use other words. But if you're using keywords for repeating words for emphasis, that's good. That can be a good thing to do. So you just have to know why you're doing it, and it can be good or it can be bad. And if you're just doing it because you can't think of another word, it's better to use a thesaurus and use a different word. Okay, and also here we have a little bit about conjunctions and transitions. And when we talked about fixing sentence errors, conjunctions, of course, came up. We called them the fanboys. So these are often really important. And depending on the conjunction or the transitional word you use, like while here or because, it can change the meaning. And you, again, if you want to pause this and take a look at it, you can, but just want to share some of these things. Now, this is really important. This is on page 23 to 24. If you're trying to make a comparison or concession or contrast, talk about time or addition of something, these are transitional words you can use if you get tired of using the same transitional words. And again, this is on the in the Harbrace book from page 23 to 24. Let's see. I think I just want to do one or two of these. Obviously, punctuation is an important part. Most everybody is not having trouble with this, but I just want to show you a couple of examples here. So of how punctuation can really cause miscommunication at times. So if we look at a sentence like this, it obviously says, let's eat grandma, which sounds funny the way I just said it, right? So it all depends on how you punctuate. So if you want to pause it and think about, would you put a comma, period, question mark, exclamation mark, colon, semicolon? These are our main forms of punctuation to make this sentence correct. So let's see what we would do. So again, if you did it like this, it looks like grandma's dinner, right? So that's not good. If you put a comma after eat and then you put your exclamation mark, you're calling grandma to come to dinner. So again, the point of these are kind of silly, but just to show that you're writing an email at work, you're writing a paper for your history class, you're sending your professor a message or something. Depending on how you use punctuation, it can really cause a difference in meaning. Here's another one. I find inspiration in cooking, my family, and my dog. So again, if you don't punctuate this correctly, it can mean something totally different. And let's just look at the examples here. And this is where you would put a comma, I think. And then this basically means I find inspiration in cooking, also in my family, and also in my dog. These three things. Not cooking, my family, and my dog. Here they are in the skillet. And this is, again, commas matter, right? You want to use commas correctly. What the comma does is it just tells the person reading it. Now, obviously, if you write the sentence, you know what you mean, and so you're clear about it, but the comma allows the audience or the reader to understand cooking, my family, and my dog are very separate categories that you all enjoy, but they don't all go together as one. So that's where the comma comes into that list. Just a couple more. I like this one a lot. I want to thank my parents, Tiffany and God. If anybody ever remember the Percy Jackson stories, I read those with my kids, and they had what they were called. I think they were called. They were half God and half human, right? If you remember, the gods came down. If anybody read those when you were younger, and this is kind of what we have with this example. If we punctuate it wrong, we have the demigods or the half bloods, I think they were called, who were half human and half God. Because if you look at the first one, I want to thank my parents, comma. So a lot of people would say we don't need this. It's called an Oxford comma. It's an extra comma when you have three items in a series or three things. And generally, yeah, it's still clear, but sometimes, like this example, it's unclear, and so you need this extra comma. So in this one, it says, I want to thank my parents, I want to thank Tiffany, and I want to thank God. See, it's all three. They're separate by the comma. But the first one, I want to thank my parents, and my parents are basically Tiffany and God. Which is funny in a way, right? Because that's like the Percy Jackson thing again, if you remember those books. All right, so we'll go through. We're not going to do all these. I just wanted to have a lot of these examples, but I just wanted to show you a couple of them. This is what's called a semicolon. So I'm sorry, I love you. If you put a period right there, it sounds like you're regretting your relationship or caring about someone. If you put a semicolon, it makes it like two separate sentences. I'm sorry, I love you. So you're apologizing. And this one, with just a period, it sounds like you're regretting loving that person. And this is when we use quotation marks. A lot of times quotation marks are used, obviously to report someone's speech, like we talked about, I think, last week. But they can also be used as a way of making something not literally true. So you have something like this. This would be security guard without, it's an actual security guard. This is like, oh, my little security guard, right? And there's a chihuahua there, it looks like maybe. And that's why the quotations are there, because it doesn't literally mean security guard. Okay. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is our peer responses. And what I'm going to do is put this in the video, and then I'll also share this in a message with you or an email. I'm going to figure out how to do that so I can make sure and share this, or I'll post it in Blackboard. It's probably what I'll do. But at any rate, I'm going to ask you to do a peer response sometime in the next week if you can. And so I set up here the groups. I changed it a little bit, so you should have a different person this time. And you'll notice, if you can, the person across from you. So like Alejandro, if you could work with Irene, Aiden with Adelina, and Celeste with Hugo, and so on down the list, just the one across from you. And then all the emails I put here. So the easiest thing to do is, if you watch the video, you can just go back and freeze frame this and get your partner. And then when you're finished with essay 3, I think most people have handed it in, send that to your partner. And we're going to do a little bit more involved peer response this time, a little bit different. So let me share a little bit about that. The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is obviously look at your partner's introduction and what's the hook, right? Is there some kind of a hook? And remember, we talked about different introduction types. Like, you can ask a question sometimes, or you can state some surprising fact, or even a statistic of some kind, like a number. You can quote somebody. You can say it's, Albert Einstein once said, and quote that person. These are ways you can get into the paper. So is there a hook? Do they do something to kind of get your attention? Sometimes we can tell a story, an anecdote, or give a description of something. These are all ways you can hook your author, or your writer, rather. Is there a thesis statement? That's obviously very important to the kind of essays we're writing. And remember, the thesis statement should be an opinion or a position on something. It has to be debatable. So what is it about that? Is the thesis debatable in your partner's essay? What's the main idea expressed in the thesis? So what are they saying? What are they arguing for? That's your introduction. So I'm going to ask you to look at each part. Here's an example of a hook, right? An old proverb says, "He who brings sunlight into the lives of others cannot keep it from himself." So this quote is an old proverb. So it's not really a quotation. We don't know the source, and that's okay to use something like that as long as you notice and recognize that it's not from a exact person, but it's an old proverb. Here's our thesis statement. By giving their time and talent to the local community, these students not only enrich the lives of others, but they receive many surprising benefits for themselves. And so this is going to be one of those, it's an essay that's basically arguing for the benefit of community service and giving your time and talent to serve others. And this quote introduces it. So there's your hook, right? And it's a quotation, right? That's what it's, and these are again some of the ways on the right side that you can hook your audience. How about this one? What's the hook? Millions of law-abiding Americans are physically addicted to caffeine, and most of them don't even know it. Well, I'm aware of it. I know it. But anyway, a lot of us don't, maybe. So this is going to be about the idea that caffeine is a drug and it's addictive, right? There's a guy named Michael Pollan who just was talking about this in a book that I saw a few months back, and I thought that was very interesting. He was talking about some other drugs, too, that are very common, like alcohol and marijuana. And he talked about all of them and how they affect our society in different ways. It was very interesting. But what are we doing here? Is it a narration, a description, a quotation, a surprising fact or statistic, why it's important, common ground, or background information? So I think you can think about this if you want to pause it, but it's a surprising fact or statistic. Maybe that's not that surprising to you, but when I read this the first time, I thought, yeah, that's kind of gets my attention, right? So that's a hook, something to get the reader's attention. Where's the thesis? All right. So this is from an essay that's all about a person who worked in a brewery, and they had to deal with beer bottles all day, basically, and taking care of getting the beer into the bottle. So not a very exciting job, and they got bored with it. But what's the writer's opinion? That was the most boring and painful job I've ever had, but it motivated me to change my life. So you can guess from that, they're going to talk about how even though this job was very boring, it led them to something else. And that's what that essay focuses on. Or how about this one? What's the topic and what's the opinion? If you want to take a minute and pause and read this, you can. And then I'll tell you what I think is going on here. So this is all about someone who loves to ride bikes. And she has this powder blue 10-speed, Raleigh 10-speed. She's put more than 10,000 miles on it. And it's hard to believe, but Diane is a bike fanatic. So this is a kind of a thesis because we're stating something. Diane is our subject, and we're going to say she's a bike fanatic, and then that means now we've got to prove that. We've got to prove, what does that mean? Fanatic is pretty serious. It's not just like I like bicycles, but a fanatic, and now we have to prove that. So our thesis is right here. You've got your topic, Diane, and her opinion is she's a bike fanatic. So again, see if you can find a thesis as you read through your partner's paper, and then also see if you can find, do they have 2 or 3 body paragraphs, and maybe does each one have a topic sentence? So again, I know this is a little more involved, but I really want us to dig in a little bit and help each other improve by doing this peer response and make it really worthwhile for all of us. For every student. It's obviously worthwhile for me because I get to see improvement in your writing. Consider how each topic supports the thesis. Are there any paragraphs off the topic? So if they're writing about something you think it might not really support their thesis, you could mention that. And then finally, this is a couple of ways that we've talked about these a lot, these 5 methods of persuasion. I think I presented on this a while back, a couple of weeks ago. So these are ways that you can support your thesis. So see if they're doing any of those things. And then finally, is there a conclusion paragraph? Is it kind of a summary? Does it have some new ideas? Does it clarify the thesis? So you might not answer yes or whatever to all these questions, but some of them as you look at their conclusion. And there's different ways to conclude. Again, these are 6 ways that I think I talked about in one of the previous classes. And you can think about that too, that they do a certain conclusion type. And that's really all I wanted to cover for tonight. But let me go back, to the peer response part and just mention again, if you can, once your essay is finished, most people have already written it, if you could go ahead and send it to this person, and then the peer response questions are in Blackboard under the course content folder. Let me know if you have any questions as always, and I will hope to hear from you soon.